Okay, so what we're going to do now that we know all about the perspectives in psychology, we are going to explain this person's behavior through some of those perspectives. So according to the biological perspective, a biological psychologist would look at this individual and say, okay, his behavior is not normal. He's not fitting into social norms, meaning he's not doing what society expects of him. But a biological psychologist is pretty much going to approach this individual's behavior through biology. And in psychology, mostly the biological perspective deals with the brain. So a biological psychologist might say, what is happening in his brain? Is there a part of his brain that's malfunctioning? Are there neurotransmitters that aren't firing correctly that are making this individual do what it is he is doing? Which we don't really know what that is, but we do know that his behavior is not normal. A behavioral psychologist or the behaviorist viewpoint is not going to say what's happening in his brain, because remember, that's something that we can't see. And behavioral psychologists want to explain behavior through only things that are observable. So a behavioral psychologist might say, okay, perhaps this individual is getting paid to behave the way that he is. Here you have John Stewart and Philip Zimbardo, which is one of the most famous psychologists. We'll talk about him later on in the semester. Maybe those two are in cahoots and they're paying this individual to behave the way that he does. So that money is a reward for him dressing this way or acting this way. The behavioral perspective says, what do we observe? We should only be using observable behaviors to explain something. The humanistic perspective, remember, this perspective says that our focus is on the individual's capability to reach our full potential. So perhaps this individual is trying to do that. Perhaps his decision-making processes about himself, he feels like he needs to dress this way. The humanistic perspective would focus on feelings. Maybe this individual is trying to reach self-actualization, meaning they're trying to be the best person that they can be. Perhaps this individual's self-concept, how they view themselves, is not necessarily as a male, but as a male dressed in odd clothing, many of which we would assume that a female would be wearing. The evolutionary perspective in psychology would say, okay, what is happening in this individual's genetic code? They might focus on things like natural selection or survival of the fittest. An evolutionary perspective or an evolutionary psychologist might say, okay, what has gone on in this individual's upbringing? That's the nurture part of things, or what's happening in nature, what's happening with his genes. Perhaps as a young child, he liked to dress up in girls' clothes because he was brought up around a sister or many females, and that is why he is acting the way that he is. So you can see from all of these different perspectives, we're able to explain his behavior. I would highly recommend that you focus on that chart in your book on the different perspectives in psychology. You're also going to be given one in class. Now, a lot of you are probably taking this class because you think that you would like to have a career in psychology. This is just a very short list of things that you can do with a psychology degree. I have to say that with an undergrad degree in psychology, which is what I have, you cannot do any of these things. You definitely have to go and get a master's degree in psychology, and most oftentimes you're either going to have to get a PhD in psychology or go to medical school if you want to see patients. One of the first things that you probably think of when you think of a psychologist is going into a therapist's office, sitting on a couch, and talking with that person. That would be clinical and counseling psychology. Developmental psychology is going to focus on children's development over time. So developmental psychologists might see a patient with autism, a child with autism, or a child who's having trouble, behavioral problems in class. Educational psychology, most public schools have an educational psychologist in the building. And experimental psychology, a psychologist is going to focus on research and development of experiments. We're going to get into experiments in Chapter 1. They're going to be responsible for setting up those experiments, gathering the data, getting the results. An industrial and organizational psychologist is someone who's going to work in a place of business. These individuals will work with employees in a business, trying to get them to work more efficiently together. An IO psychologist might also focus on how a business can improve their sales by targeting or by focusing on advertising. So how can we appeal to consumers' psyches through our advertising? Industrial organizational psychologist is really interesting. It's actually what I thought I wanted to do in college, and we'll talk more about it as we go on. Personality psychologist is going to focus on the different personality theories that are out there. A psychiatrist is different than a psychologist in that a psychiatrist can prescribe medicine to a patient. To become a psychiatrist, you have to go to medical school, you have to get a medical degree, and then you would have to do extensive training in psychiatry to be able to prescribe patients medicine. Social work therapists and counselors are all lumped into careers in psychology because they're dealing with individuals who are in need in some way, and often the times those require a higher level of degree, most often a master's degree. So the big issues that we're going to be focusing on in this class is the nature versus nurture controversy. Psychologists like to debate, are we a product of an innate inborn tendency, just like those early philosophers did? And are we controlled by our genetic makeup? Or does most of our personality, is most of who we are coming from nurture, from our surroundings? Are we a reflection of experiences and upbringing, or are we hindered by our genetic code? Psychologists also like to talk about the person versus the situation issue. Is behavior by a human influenced by that person's disposition or the outside environment? They also like to focus on stability versus change. Are behavior patterns learned in childhood permanent, or do people change over time? Do you think the personality you have now is also the personality that you're going to have in 20 years? Was it the same personality that you had when you were smaller? Psychologists like to focus on diversity versus universality. So how am I like every person? Why am I more like some people and unlike others? What is it that gives us those bonds with one another? And then, of course, the mind and the body. What is the relationship between the mind and the body? Are they connected, or are they distinct things? So we'll be covering these issues as we go. Please remember, anything that's bold is what is extremely important. You do need to be copying down online notes, these online lecture notes, just as if we were doing this together in class. Please make sure that you are reading. If you're not reading the textbook and listening to the online lectures, your scores on reading quizzes and tests will not be very good. As always, if you have questions for me, please send me an email. That information is on Edmodo.